Welcome back to week 4. In this week we will talk about emotions, feelings and motivation. This time we're going to talk about what emotions are versus what feelings are. We're going to talk about what emotions do. We're going to talk about what wanting is and what motivation is. We're also going to talk about different ways in which we can assess and measure emotions and feelings and motivation. And finally we're going to look at some examples of how this can be used in real-life settings. When we look at the brain, we also see that wanting and liking are two different systems in the brain. We see that the wanting system is reflected in changes in activation such as the basal ganglia and the nucleus accumbens, for example, while our changes in our liking, in our preference, the conscious preference, is reflected in the changes in activation of the orbital frontal cortex. So there are two different systems in the brain. Now let's take an example from real life where we tested 100 people from a nationwide sample in the US. All these people were exposed to several ads, and we're just going to look at one particular ad and how they responded with their motivation response, or the so-called wanting response. Now let's look at two different studies. One performed by Brian Knudsen at Stanford University and one performed here at the Copenhagen Business School. In the study by Brian Knudsen and colleagues, participants were put into an fMRI scanning session while they were making different choices. They were given money before going into the scanner, and they were given different options to buy products. First, they saw the product. Then they were given the price of the product, and finally, they had the option to buy the product for the money or save the money. What the researchers did then was to go back to the original data when people looked at the products and see whether they could predict what people would buy just by looking at their brain scan. What they found was that brain activation of a particular part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens or ventral striatum predicted choice. Stronger activation of this region when people looked at the product predicted the likelihood that people were going to buy the product. The second phase was the price phase. Here they found that increased price was associated with stronger activation of the insula and also lower likelihood of purchase. And this was still 4 to 8 seconds before making their choice. So based on this model, researchers were able to predict choice several seconds before people felt like or actually executed a product choice. Instead of looking at the ventral striatum activation, we looked at what's called the prefrontal asymmetry index. So this is the relative engagement of the frontal left versus frontal right brain. This is an indication of motivation or even wanting, or approach avoidance as we call it. In this study, people were also exposed to products several seconds before they made up their minds, and they were imbued with money that they could use during the experiment. What we found was that at the time that people saw the product, the higher the motivation index was, the more people were paying for the product. So in this sense, it's as if the brain is making up its mind several seconds before people are consciously making up their minds. And this is the root of why we are studying the brain basis of consumer choice. And this concludes the session about emotions and feelings and motivation. And as you can see, we now know a bit more about what drives consumer choice, both consciously and unconsciously. Next week, we're going to talk about learning and memory, and I look forward to see you then.